Ladies and gentlemen, the ERC Forum 2023, and we are now moving on to the informative sessions that are going to be delivered by the esteemed speakers from leading organizations in energy industry. And also, each section, we have an honor to have the moderator by Honorable Session Chair. So upcoming next, up on the stage, we are going to proceed to the first session of today, the Global Outlook of Energy Markets by 2023 and beyond, the best practices, experience sharing, and future market trends. And now I would like to introduce to you the session chair, Dr. Kurujit Nakornthap, Executive Director, Petroleum Institute of Thailand.
Hello, my name is Sudama Yunedama, the ERC Commissioner. Allow me to introduce our distinguished chairperson. He is the most respectable figure in Thai energy sector, and he has been participating in Thai energy development since the early day. And we are very honored to have him as a chairperson, Dr. Kurujit Nakornthap. The floor is yours, krab.
Good morning, Sawadee krab, everyone. I'm very delighted and honored to be invited by the ERC Thailand to share this first session. And in the interest of time, may I invite the two speakers for the session one on the stage, please. First, Mr. Jie Tang, Practice Manager, Energy Extractive Global Practice, East Asia and Pacific from the World Bank. And Mr. Jun Yong Song, Senior Energy Specialist, East Asia and the Pacific region, also from the World Bank. For this session, we have about not more than 30 minutes, including Q&A session. So I just want to get to the point and first introduce Mr. Jie Tang from the World Bank. Jie Tang received his education in electrical engineering bachelor degree in from Hydropower College from Wuhan University in China and MBA from Cambridge University, England. He has been working in the World Bank since 2001 and with engineering background. He also was instrumental in the China Three Gorge Dam project. So he is fit to oversee World Bank activity worldwide with respect to renewable energy. And also Mr. Ju Yung Song, Senior Energy Specialist from World Bank. He has education background in applied statistics from Yonsei University in Korea and MA in International Relations from Johns Hopkins University. So he's an energy specialist from World Bank. So I would like to ask both of you to speak on this global outlook on energy market and transitions. What do you see from the World Bank radar on this topic? Thank you.
Okay, good morning, distinguished Chairman, distinguished Permanent Secretary of Energy. Thank you for the invitation to this workshop. I'm very glad to be here to talk about the World Bank perspective from global perspective on the energy market development and also for energy transition. So our presentation will have 4 parts. What is really the context that we're talking about the energy transition now? What are the key challenges? And then how the World Bank is supporting different client countries, where I'm in charge of World Bank support for 26 countries in East Asia and Pacific region. So going forward, what are the key messages from the World Bank side? Today, when we talk about the energy transition, we have to have a view on global context. If you look at the CO2 emission, most of the emission is coming from the energy sector, and the CO2 emission is continue to grow. This, and for the emission side, and China and India still take a majority part of the coal consumption in the world. If you look at the contribution to emission, energy actually contributes to more than 73% of the global emission reduction. So how do you really manage the energy transition is critical for climate change fighting globally. Then if you look at the energy emission side, Asian countries spend more than 73% of the coal consumption in the world. If you talk about the top 6 countries in Asian country, China, India, Philippines, Vietnam, Pakistan, and Indonesia, these are the 6 top countries which consume more than 70%. And the rest of Asia countries consume 2.9%. And if you look at the coal consumption, what is the emission contribution? The majority is really from the power sector. So the blue side on the right side is looking for the coal consumption for power generation. Side is really the industry contributions to emission reduction. So 73% of the total emission mainly coming from the power generation in the 6 countries in the world. If you look at the electricity side, compare the developing country versus the developing country. Developing country per capita consumption is much lower than the developed country. So the projected growth of electricity will grow faster in developing countries and particularly in our Asia countries. Then if you look at the projection about the history about the power demand growth, Vietnam, China, Indonesia, Philippines still, who are the key countries in this Asia for electricity coal use for power generation, you see the load growth is continuing to grow very fast, particularly in Vietnam and China. Then on the other side, in all the Asia countries, every country has made commitment about a national determined commitment about their commitment on how to reduce CO2 emission in the world. About 23 countries in Asia has committed to reach net zero by 2050. Some of the other countries have announced earlier or later, but the majority is trying to reach net zero by 2050. Then what are the initiatives taken by different governments in energy transition? So among these top countries, right, every country has announced their target for carbon neutrality and also announced a moratorium on building new coal power plant. At the same time, international organizations are putting together support to Asian countries. For example, the Just Energy Partnership is mobilizing $15.5 billion concessional financing supporting energy transition in Vietnam. They have also committed about $20 billion concessional financing supporting Indonesia in its energy transition path. So with the government commitment, international partners supporting concessional financing, ADB, World Bank, those international organizations is also behind this and supporting government in its energy transition process. Then World Bank has done a very deep dive on country climate and development report in all these major countries. So in Asia, in the area that I was managing right now, we have done the detailed deep dive in China, Indonesia, Philippines, and Vietnam. We look at the economic wide to achieve government objective on their NDC. What are the key actions needed? How does the government current policy and planning will drive to the country by 2040, 2050? In addition to achieve accelerated decarbonization, which are consistent with 1.5 degree in Paris Agreement, then there is key policy recommendations on what can be done, how to manage the impacts. So this report is really economic-wide, starting on every sector, including the power sector, on what is, if you continue business as usual, what will it look like? Then if you accelerate the energy transition, what are the costs, benefit, impacts, what are the key policy recommendations? So it's a very comprehensive report done by more than 1,000 economists mobilized by the World Bank, right, throughout globally. So we're doing country by country. So this year we're going to do more country diagnostics in Asia countries. Then as a key summary, right, you see the upper curve is really, if you look at the 4 major countries in East Asia part, China, Indonesia, Philippines, and Vietnam. On right side is Indonesia, Philippines, and Vietnam. If the government continue its current announced policy and planning, the emission will be looking like in the upper curve. But actually, government can accelerate the decarbonization, which is a wrong curve, which is a study by the World Bank. If you do follow a certain path, your emission can also be reduced down. So China versus the other 3 countries. This is part of the result in the study reports. Then what does that mean? Which means that all these countries need to scale up renewable energy 5 times before 2040 in order to achieve a lower emission curve. And then on renewable energy side, you see this represents a World Bank study globally on different countries. The dotted line is a current baseline in each country, but on renewable energy part, they need to scale up according to the blue line in order to achieve their NDC and also to be Paris Alignment Agreement. And also on the right side, you see the coal capacity need to be gradually phased down. It also represents the dotted line is the government current baseline, and the blue line is what the recommendation made by the World Bank can be achieved. Then what does that mean, right? So that means investment will be increased hugely. If you look at the global investment on renewable energy, in 2020 it's about 1.2 trillion US dollar in clean energy. But by 2022, over 2 years, it has grown up to more than 1.7 trillion US dollars. If you are looking for the leading countries which are making clean energy investment, is China, Europe, United States, and Japan. Then if you look at the price going down, I think the technology innovation as well as market is driving continuously the cost of renewable energy down over the past decades. The solar PV project, right, if you look at by 2021, before the Ukraine crisis, it has already reached more than below 2 US cents per kilowatt hour. So if you look at 2022, the price going up a little bit is because of the disruption on the supply chain due to the geopolitical conflicts. Then if you look at the PV plus battery altogether, in 2022, the most recent auction, 126 gigawatt, PV plus battery, 3.8 US cents per kilowatt hour. This is very competitive even compared with coal. Look at the auction of wind. If you look at 2022, onshore wind has achieved 3.5 US cents per kilowatt hour, 1.8 gigawatt. This is also the prevailing market price now happening in China, around 3.5 US cents per kilowatt hour onshore, including 10 to 15% of battery storage as part of the cost. So they can achieve 3.5. What is the offshore wind? Offshore wind actually, you see in China, the recent auction reached more than below 3 US cents per kilowatt hour. But the majority, if you include in battery storage 10 to 15%, in China, the price is around 4 US cents offshore, 3.5 cents onshore, wind plus battery storage. So that's a price achieved prevailing large cost. So China, the renewable energy is growing very fast. They are adding 120 gigawatt renewable energy per year. And the pump storage, they have 50 gigawatt right now. It's going to reach 100 gigawatt by 2030. The green hydrogen price globally, you look, by 2030, it can become, the price will be cut by 50. So the green hydrogen investment is happening also very fast. Then if you look at the CCUS, now more and more commercially based operations are being built up. You see a huge increase picking up on the CCUS. This is a CCUS project in China. The price range is about 30 US dollar to 60 US dollar per ton of CO2. then clean energy development in Asia is picking up different speed. Some countries are going faster, some countries are going slow. So what are the key challenges on the energy transition? Perhaps let me pass over to Jun.
Yeah, thank you, Jie. And well, thank you very much again. It's my privilege to share our perspectives in front of distinguished guests and the great audience. So what are the challenges, especially for developing countries, to scale up renewable energy and to make an energy transition in the power sector? So we see there are largely 4 challenges: energy security, financing, and affordability, and just transition. So let me get into a little bit more detail of each of them. So one is energy security. As we've seen in an earlier slides, the electricity and energy demand in developing countries are growing much faster than developed countries, right? And meeting this fast-growing electricity demand is becoming a priority for any country in developing countries. But first of all, the fossil fuel market is becoming more volatile, responding to many crises. So in a fossil fuel-based power system, meeting energy security is already a challenge. And then when it comes to renewable energy, this is an example from California. So as the share of solar PV and wind, the variable renewable energy, is growing, the rest of the grid has to stand with a very sudden drop and surge in the net load, as you see on the left side. So the grid has to burden more technical challenges, which will require energy storage to balance them off. So in California, they had to increase their battery storage capacity from 500 megawatt in 2020, years, 10 times increase. So this will be required for any countries who will rapidly increase the share of renewable energy in their system, which is a challenge for many developing countries as well. And this growing demand on energy storage also gives some risks and opportunities, because there will be a risk of critical mineral supply for manufacturing battery storage. As you see on the left side, the lithium price has been volatile over the past few years, which will also pose a risk to the cost side. But also at the same time, it gives an opportunity because more battery storage will become available for recycling and reuse, mainly driven from the US and the China market, which are the 2 biggest storage markets. And to follow that, the battery recycling industry is now emerging, and which will bring more opportunities for economic development, as well as cost reduction of the battery cases. And then in the energy security, we should not overlook the importance of the power sector resilience. As the climate and weather risks are rising, the system has to bear with the more natural disasters and other shocks, and to cope with the energy security. And as you see on the right side, in the US, the power outages due to weather situation is growing over time, which we will expect to see in the Pacific Island countries in the region, as well as other Southeast Asian countries. So this is another angle for the countries to look at to ensure energy security. And then let's get into financing and affordability challenges. So this clean energy transition will require a lot of investment. So from our analysis, for China, Indonesia, Philippines, Vietnam, the 4 major countries in this region, the total investment needs in the power sector for energy transition will reach $9 trillion by 2040. And if you look at only Indonesia, Philippines, Vietnam, more or less in South Asian region countries, their investment needs will grow by more than 70% compared to their investment needs in the current policies, which is already quite high actually for these countries to reach. So these investment needs will grow further for energy transition, and meeting these financing needs will become a challenge for many developing countries. And as a result, because of the increasing investment needs in the sector, electricity cost is also expected to grow with the growing investment. It will not grow as much as a capital cost increase because we will have savings on fuel cost and others. But our analysis showed that for 3 countries, Indonesia, Vietnam, Philippines, on average, the electricity cost will grow by 16%, which will become a burden for the whole economy. So managing this affordability issue is another concern for developing states. And then here are a few things to consider in financing and affordability. So concessional climate finance is available to help de-risking investment and reduce the cost. So as we know very well, Green Climate Fund, Climate Investment Funds, they are like two large funds that provide a concessional financing for climate change actions, and especially accelerating coal transition or ACT program on the climate investment funds. They selected Indonesia and Philippines as two of the 4 first pilot countries for coal transition, and they are providing massive concessional financing up to $500 million for each of the countries. And then another thing is carbon pricing and revenue from carbon pricing. So this has a growing potential to meet some of the financing needs in energy transition and reduce the cost. And as you see globally, the carbon revenue is growing rapidly. But if you look at in Asia, emission trading schemes or carbon tax is still at the early stage. Only a few countries have adopted this carbon pricing instruments in Asia. So there's a potential to go further and raise the revenue to support the financing for energy transition. But actually, if we look at domestic carbon credit mechanism, which is probably the first step toward more stringent carbon pricing on emission trading scheme or carbon tax, Asia is actually doing better. And especially Thailand. I mean, Thailand has been implementing this voluntary emission reduction system program for years, so it is a pioneer in the region to do that. And now Indonesia and Vietnam, they are following steps to establish domestic carbon trading schemes to raise this carbon revenue. And then there's an international support to meet these financing needs in developing countries. So Just Energy Transition Partnership, initiated by G7 countries, this is an example. So they provide a large scale of concessional financing committee to South Africa, Indonesia, and Vietnam. In Indonesia, Vietnam, they reached an agreement last year with specific targets toward 2030, and they are working actively to mobilize this investment to support their energy transition investments. And then this is a green financing. This is another angle to meet the financing needs for energy transition. So these new instruments that are linked with the sustainability or ESG is growing rapidly, and there are potentials to harness further in developing countries. And for these, the defining green taxonomy for green financing and also developing domestic capital market to increase the flow to green financing would be required in developing countries. And then the last challenge on just transition. So as we all know, this transition is good for global benefit and good for countries, but there will be adverse impacts economically, socially, environmentally, and even gender impacts on part of the countries, part of the population. And managing this adverse impact carefully would be important to ensure a more inclusive and sustainable transition in developing countries particularly. So this is a short example. So in Poland, if you look at the coal mining workers, this is only less than 1% of the total employment at the national level. So it may not look very big, but if you look at the coal-heavy municipalities, actually they constitute more than 40% of employment. So these municipalities, if they implement the transition away from coal and fossil fuel, they will be heavily affected economically, as well as enterprises, communities, and workers will be heavily affected. That's the case of Poland. And in China, there are still more than 4 million of workers in coal mining itself. And if you look at across the whole coal value chain, there are a lot more workers and enterprises, and then communities that are relying on these workers and enterprises for their living. So how to manage this impact carefully, so without leaving them behind the transition, is an important matter, and then require earlier planning and proper policy support to support them in the transition process. Lastly, this transition impact will be disproportionate. So this is an example from our China case study. So through the job transition from fossil fuel-based to clean energy-based, probably there will be more jobs in urban level. There are more jobs for skilled workers, and male and the inner island will be more affected. So it is important to understand who are the winners of the transitions and who will be most affected for the transition, and how to set up some protection mechanism for during the transition period is important. And again, this transition will have a most impact on the lowest income households, as we see on the right side. So how to set up the policy packages to support them and protect them in the transition will be also a challenge for going forward for countries. So let me stop here. Okay, one more slide. And here, in meeting the financing needs, private sector capital and private participation will be more than important than ever. And government has a very, very critical role to play in achieving that. So this is a framework that is coming from the latest World Bank report named Scale Up to Phase Down, which set up a framework to show what is the critical role of the government in mobilizing private capital, all the way from political willing and macro fiscal management toward the supportive regulatory and policy environment and institutional capacity to bring in private capital and make a virtuous cycle to scale up renewable energy in these countries. Let me stop here and hand it back to Jie for World Bank engagement.
So given the context and the energy transition can be also an opportunity given the huge challenges going on. So we see that for energy transition, there is a need of close partnership between private sector and the public sector. And the government will play a critical role in creating an enabling environment for private sector to participate, for mobilizing globally available concessional financing to help manage the cost, to work on various impacts, particularly on social, macroeconomic impacts in those countries where the coal value chain still represent a major part of the economy, like in China, Indonesia, in these countries. Then how World Bank can help you capture this opportunity while dealing with this challenging and to build a more sustainable energy sector in the client country? So our support actually is organized in 4 pillars throughout the globally, but also in Asia country, in all this area that we are working on. So the first pillar is really help government how to phase down and phase out coal use and coal power generation in the power sector. That including detailed sector planning and the incentive mechanism, also managing the impacts of phasing down the coal, as we just mentioned. Of course, the second major part is to scale up renewable energy and energy efficiency. One thing particular I want to say is here is really, we see that the public sector play a critical role, particularly the power utility, who are playing a critical role in modernizing the power network to be flexible and be capable of integration of variable renewable energy. This is one of the transmission network is one of the biggest risks that are perceived from private sector when they scale up renewable energy. Another part is really industry and transport, decarbonization, particularly electrification in the transport sector, is also another critical area that the World Bank is supporting. The third part is really energy transition, which just mentioned by my colleagues, right? Given the huge social, economic, impacts on energy transition, facing away from fossil fuel to clean energy, how do you really deal with a social impact, economic impact to ensure a just transition in the sector? Finally, I think that's the most important part is World Bank support on sector governance, particularly on what are the policy, regulation, market mechanism need to be in place to enable this energy transition. How do you build up the financial viability and the sustainability of the entire power sector? Make sure that the private sector can make a profit from clean energy, but the utilities can manage the cost and the people can afford for the new electricity given the energy transition. So these are the key critical areas, and World Bank particularly mobilize concessional financing to support particularly power utility and modernize its power network. In addition, we also mobilize huge amount of grants supporting different government, thinking through all the policy regulation through our technical assistance to government and public agencies. Then this is our operation in this East Asia and Pacific region. Focusing on this. One thing I want to highlight is really, for example, in Indonesia, we're working very closely with the PLN, the power utility, by establishing their ESG framework so that help them to access sustainable linked financing globally. Currently, we're helping them to mobilize around $3 billion from sustainable financing from the global market. And on the other side, in China, we are working with the government on policy and the regulation on how to manage the coal mine closing out and the coal power plant repurposing and phasing out. We're also working on the repurposing, coal power plant repurposing in Indonesia and the Philippines. So what are the key messages from the World Bank side to government? I think first, energy transition becomes a core part of sustainable energy sector development across all the Asian countries now. And we see that alignment of climate change action as well as energy transition plans with domestic development objectives are important. It's not only the climate change or energy transition, but how do you also combine those for domestic sector development objectives? That's very important. Third is really, we see that technology innovation is really driving down the cost of clean energy, but still remain a challenging managing the huge amount of financing and also the cost, as we talked earlier, right, in developing countries. Then we see in these top 6 countries, including India, Pakistan, China, Indonesia, Philippines, and Vietnam, about $12 trillion need to be mobilized just for power sector in the next 20 years. Now it's in the next 18 years. Government have a critical role to create an enabling environment for private sector participation and de-risk their transactions from private sector, particularly in clean energy side. Government can also lead the effort to tap the concessional climate financing available and unlock the potential of carbon pricing to fill in the financing gap. Then also finally, government also needs to consider strategically position themselves to benefit from the global energy transition trend. Energy transition is not only in this country, not in this region, but globally. So different country has different comparative advantage. Each country needs to position themselves in the whole process in the next 20 years. Thank you very much. That's our presentation.
Thank you very much, Mr. Jie Tang and Mr. Jun Yong Song. I saw firsthand that you have 50 slides, and I was wondering how could you manage to present in 30 minutes, but you did manage to present in 30 minutes. I'm now open for some questions. If the audience have any query to ask the 2 speakers. While you are thinking about the question, I just note down some key points from the 2 speakers. I think the World Bank is here to help with the finance, of course. I think your action plan is to reduce codependency, especially in the Asia country, and scale up the use of renewable energy. And while doing that, you anticipate that there will be impact economically, socially, environmentally, especially to the poor people. So there must be a just transition. A nice word, but difficult to do. You know? And also improve sector governance of the government. I know I jotted down, you have tariff reform. It's right to the point of the ERC tariff reform. And also subsidy reform. You want more subsidy or you want to phase out subsidy?
So for energy transition, how do you really drive energy transition through based more on market mechanism? Particularly, we see there is a heavy subsidy on fossil fuel side in Asian countries. For example, in Indonesia, they have a DMO, domestic market obligation on how much coal has to be provided to PLN for power generation at a much lower market price. That put coal power at a unique competitive position. So in order to let the market mechanism to drive energy transition, you need to gradually to reform the subsidy policy, remove subsidy to the fossil fuel, make a playing field for clean energy and energy efficiency.
Okay. Yeah. Please note the World Bank is for removing subsidy, not more subsidy, and tariff reform. And I noticed in one of your slides, Mr. Jun Yong Song, that you anticipate the price of electricity to rise 16% by 2040 in your country. In Thailand, it's more than that already, just over the one year. Okay. Also, the we see that the solar PV electricity cost is coming down so much. I think if I'm not mistaken, in one of your slides in Qatar, it's negative price.
Oh, that could be, it's not a negative price,
Minus
right?
1.5.
It's 1.5%.
Oh, okay. Okay. And wind is also coming down. So it's time for investment. And World Bank is there to help with all this funding for investment. And one thing that is alarming to me that you said that we need 12 trillion US dollars in 6 countries to phase out coal to meet this energy transition target. If I'm in one of your slides, that's a lot of money, you know. I think during COP26, the rich country pledged 100 billion US dollar for poorer country to do this energy transition. None of that coming yet, you know. So what World Bank role to do?
So first, the $12 trillion is not for completely phase out. It's just to reach the 2040 energy transition target as analytical work done by the World Bank, right? So that's a total investment on clean energy, on transmission and distribution. For example, in China, the investment on network versus generation, right, is almost 50-50%. But in other countries, perhaps the clean energy take up around 60-70%, the network 20-30%. So in total, to achieve the target, bring down the CO2 emission by almost 80% from current level by 2040, your investment on clean energy, on transmission and network will need $12 trillion US. On the one side, to manage the cost, this $12 trillion investment will lead to increase of electricity cost in those countries by roughly around 16%. That's how the 16% coming from. In order to manage the cost, World Bank is working very actively by mobilizing both grant and the concessional financing, supporting our country. For example, we have about a $5 billion US portfolio in the energy program that I'm managing in East Asia country. We are lending out between $1 to $2 billion per year concessional financing. But the $100 million promised at the COP26, I think JETP is one of the steps, and the G7 countries are continuously to working on bring concessional financing. But of course, we also hear the voice from the government that they are expecting faster and more concessional financing to help manage the cost of the investment.
Thank you. Anyone want to ask any question? One last question. I see that you have a World Bank country climate report for 3 countries, China, Indonesia, Philippines, and Vietnam. Do you have one for Thailand?
That's currently in very close discussion with a distinguished permanent secretary. World Bank is putting our support in full scheme for Thailand. So it's in the process of discussion. We are expecting a request from CCDR, not only the CCDR, but also concessional financing grant for technical assistance on what policy regulation need to be further. Thailand is doing very well, to be frank, right? But how do we build on the excellency you already built to be the next step excellency? We're expecting a close collaboration with Thai government.
I suspect we did not borrow you very much, so you don't do any report on us. And also you mentioned the green hydrogen and carbon capture and utilization storage. Do you think that is realistic? What is your World Bank view?
Yeah, from our CCDR's development report, sector analytical work, to achieve 1.5 degree, you really need the CCUS green hydrogen to kick in around the year 2035, 2040. Currently, I think the developing countries are still trying to invest hugely, bring down the cost. And we are expecting CCUS to be largely deployed by 2035, 2040, and later, eventually bring down the CO2 emission to net zero by 2050. So this is something that we are watching very closely. We are working with some of the country on how to enable the innovation on technology side, but also further driving down the cost. So I was in discussion with the permanent secretary. We see now CCUS almost come to commercially viable. So you see the picture, I show you what is the cost, particularly happening in China, right? Between 30 to 60 US dollar. But now the price is further driving down to around the 10, 15 US dollar, you can see the cost.
Okay. The message is go solar and wind first, hydrogen and CCUS later. So that's it. I think the organizer is standing here, remind me that we are out of time. So please give a big round of applause to the two speakers from the World Bank. Thank you very much.
And thank you very much to Dr. Kurujit as well. And we would like to express our sincere appreciation. So both speakers, could you please remain on stage? And Dr. Kurujit are going to deliver the token of appreciation for your excellent presentation. Thank you very much. So start from Mr. Jie Tang, please, from World Bank. Thank you so much. So look at the camera right in the middle. And next, Mr. Jun Kyung Song. Excellent. Thank you very much for sharing your knowledge and experiences. And thank you very much once again to the session chair, Dr. Kurujit. Distinguished guests, let's have a refreshment break for 10 minutes. We have prepared a coffee break right in front of the foyer so you can enjoy your time. And then we will come back here shortly for the next interesting session. Please enjoy.